Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take on the figures who fundamentally reshaped our world, sifting through their most influential works to extract the insights that, well, that still matter today.
And for this deep dive, you've given us an absolute giant.
We really have. We're talking about William James.
It's just impossible to grasp modern American thought, I mean, both its philosophy and its psychology, without going through James. He was born in 1842, died in 1910, and he really spans that extraordinary period where the United States was, transitioning.
Right, from what, like a post-colonial cultural outpost to a major global intellectual power?
Exactly. And you could argue that James was the primary architect of that entire shift.
Okay, so looking at the sources here, we have a huge stack. His defining philosophical works like Pragmatism, his revolutionary psychology text, The Principles of Psychology, and of course his seminal work on faith, The Varieties of Religious
A
Experience.
huge body of work.
It is. So our mission today is to give you, the listener, the complete shortcut. We want you to walk away with a thorough, practical grasp of the core, transformative ideas that changed how Americans understood truth, how we experience emotion, and the multi-layered nature of the self.
And when you measure his professional standing, it's genuinely astonishing. I mean, he wasn't just part of the revolution. In many ways, he started it.
He was the first person to teach a psychology course in the U.S.
The very first. And later, a major survey of 20th century psychological influence ranked him second only to Wilhelm Wundt.
Wundt being the official founder of experimental psychology.
The founder, yes. So James earned that title, Father of American Psychology, completely on merit.
But the title doesn't capture the half of it. I mean, he was also the philosophical force who established the school of pragmatism.
Which fundamentally shifted epistemology, how we understand truth itself, from this world of abstract speculation to a world of practical, lived consequences.
And that pragmatic lens influenced everyone. You see his fingerprints all over.
Oh, absolutely. His work is the common ground for figures as intellectually disparate as the political scientist Walter Lippmann, the philosopher George Santayana,
the novelist Gertrude Stein, one of his students.
And perhaps most critically, the sociologist and civil rights pioneer W.E.B. Du Bois. James really provided the toolkit for navigating a rapidly industrializing, modernizing world that was, actively shedding these old, rigid metaphysical certainties.
Okay, so before we dive into the theories, we have to unpack the man himself. Because James was truly a reluctant genius, an academic who, by his own admission, ended up in the field almost by accident.
The context is everything when you're trying to understand James's unique perspective. You have to start with his family.
An extraordinary family.
To say the least. He was born into extraordinary wealth and a kind of hyper-intellectual hothouse. His father, Henry James Sr., was a wealthy Swedenborgian theologian.
And his older brother was Henry James, the novelist, one of the most celebrated figures in literature.
So there was this constant pressure of intellectual brilliance, but also a lot of instability. They were always moving, which gave William this truly cosmopolitan transatlantic education.
So he was fluent in German and French from the get-go.
Reading philosophy and literature from both sides of the Atlantic. He was a global thinker from the start. But here's the key friction. He didn't want to be an academic at all.
No, his first love was painting.
It was. He actually spent time apprenticing in the Newport studio of the artist William Morris Hunt. But his father, Henry Sr., was, let's say, forceful. He had deep suspicions about art as a profession, thought it was precarious.
And he pushed him toward medicine instead, a more stable career.
Vigorously.
Yeah.
And James tried to compromise. He drifted. He earned his MD from Harvard in 1869, but he hated the practical work. He never actually practiced medicine.
And his studies were constantly being interrupted, often by illness.
All the time. There was chronic stomach and eye trouble, back pain, and severe seasickness during that famous Amazon expedition in 1865.
Right. He had to come home early from that.
He did. But the physical ailments were, compounded by this profound psychological distress. He suffered for months from severe suicidal depression, which was then clinically diagnosed as neurasthenia.
A sort of catch-all term for nervous exhaustion back then.
It was, yeah. He described this period as his soul sickness. It was a full-blown existential crisis that spanned several years, particularly in the early 1870s.
And this intense internal struggle, this sense of having no fixed identity or purpose, that was really the forge for his greatest intellectual contributions, wasn't it?
It's the absolute core of his story. He was forced to find a philosophical way to live and, more importantly, to choose. He finally resolved that crisis around 1872 after a long period of reading philosophers like Charles Renouvier.
And that personal resolution led directly to his academic pivot.
Yes, and what's fascinating is that James entered the field of psychology and philosophy from the ground floor of science. He was trained in anatomy and physiology.
So he approached the mind from a biological functional perspective.
Exactly. Not a purely speculative metaphysical one like so many before him.
He admitted he was flying blind at first. There's that famous quote of his.
I never had any philosophic instruction, the first lecture on psychology I ever heard being the first I ever gave.
He was literally inventing the field as he went.
In his own academic position, moving from teaching comparative anatomy to physiology, and then eventually settling into psychology and philosophy.
This scientific turn rooted him at Harvard, where he spent almost his entire professional life. And in 1872, he found the intellectual environment he really needed.
The informal gathering known as the Metaphysical Club.
This club is such a pivotal moment in American thought. It was like a crucible of ideas, right? You have James, the great logician, Charles Sanders Peirce.
And the future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. I mean, what a group.
So what made this informal club so foundational?
Well, as the historian Louis Menand suggests, this group provided the intellectual foundation for American thought for decades because they were actively seeking an American solution to the problems of truth and certainty.
They weren't interested in dusty old European metaphysics.
No, they were grappling with Darwinism, industrialization, rapid social change. They were interested in consequences, conduct, utility. They were, testing the very first ideas of pragmatism against each other in real time.
And James's personality, his character, played a huge role in his influence.
Oh, massively. He was known for his kindness, his humility, and his witty, if sometimes irreverent humor. There's that famous story about his philosophical rival at Harvard, the absolute idealist Josiah Royce.
Right, Royce's whole system was about finding this single, unified, perfect reality, the absolute.
And James delighted in mocking it.
Yeah.
During a photography session, the story goes, James supposedly shouted at Royce, "Royce, you're being photographed. Look out. I say, damn the absolute."
And that moment just perfectly encapsulates the philosophical divide, doesn't it?
It does. James rejected systems that sought a single, monolithic, preordained truth. He embraced plurality and messiness. But despite these academic rivalries, his students absolutely revered him.
Because he offered this intellectual freedom.
That and his kind and gentle teaching style. It attracted an unbelievable roster of students who went on to define the 20th century. Theodore Roosevelt, W.E.B. Du Bois, Gertrude Stein, George Santayana.
What a list.
He was an educator who really prioritized the experience of learning and the development of the individual mind.
And his influence didn't stop at the university gates. He was politically active.
Very. Specifically as a strong opponent of American expansionism. He was a deeply vocal proponent of the Anti-Imperialist League, formed in 1898.
And that was a position that risked his reputation among many American elites, especially after the U.S. annexed the Philippines.
It was. James wrote these scathing letters and speeches arguing that imperialism betrayed American democratic ideals. In one letter, he wrote that the U.S. had just scuttled the whole moral cargo of our history by colonizing the Philippines. He saw it as a distraction from the important moral work needed at home.
So we have this reluctant, brilliant, cosmopolitan doctor who finds his purpose by resolving a personal crisis, who then surrounds himself with the sharpest minds to create an entirely new way of thinking.
That's the man.
Okay, let's transition into the core of that thought. We have to start with the foundational philosophy, pragmatism. So let's unpack this. When people think of William James, they think of pragmatism. But what did he mean precisely when he defined it? What is this philosophy, established with Charles Sanders Peirce, that rejected centuries of metaphysical certainty?
Okay, so James defined pragmatism primarily as a method. It's a way of clarifying and settling philosophical disputes. And it's fundamentally anti-metaphysical because it looks forward, not backward.
He used that great phrase, fruits over roots.
Exactly. The emphasis is on the fruits, not the roots.
So what are the fruits? Tell us more about that.
The fruit is the practical consequence. Pragmatism asks a very simple question. If this idea were true, what observable, tangible difference would it make in our actual lives?
And if there's no difference?
Then the idea, or the dispute surrounding it, is meaningless. He insists that the utility of an idea is paramount. If a notion doesn't help us interact with the world or, navigate our problems, he considered it abstract, unproductive, and not worth the paper it's written on.
So it's less about the pedigree or origin of an idea, the roots, and all about its success in the real world, the fruits.
Precisely. And this leads directly to his revolutionary concept of truth,
Which was a kind of synthesis,
a
right?
masterful synthesis.
Hmm.
Traditional philosophy had two main concepts: the correspondence theory, which says truth matches some external static reality, and the coherence theory.
That one says truth just has to fit logically with all the other beliefs we hold.
Right. Jones accepted both of those, but then he added this crucial dynamic dimension.
The human element.
The human element, exactly. For James, a thought or statement is true only if it fulfills three criteria. One, it has to correspond with actual facts.
Okay.
Two, it has to cohere or hang together with existing truths. And three, and this is the big one, it has to lead to observable, satisfactory results in practice. It must prove useful to the believer, guiding them effectively through their experience.
That makes truth sound less like a solid object you discover and more like a fluid process, something we're actively building.
That is the radical implication.
Mm.
He often used the analogy of truth acting like good-for-nothing credit.
Mm.
It's valuable because it allows us to operate in the world effectively.
And he had that essential quote about truth being plastic.
Yes, that even the most ancient parts of truth also once were plastic. They were called true for human reasons, performing what he called a marriage function of combining previous experience with newer observations.
So the idea of a purely objective truth divorced from human application.
James said it is nowhere to be found. It fundamentally challenges that detached philosophical tradition. Truth is linked inextricably to human utility and experience.
And this utility has to be quantifiable in some way, which is where we get that famous business metaphor, cash value.
The cash value term was just a brilliant way to ground this abstract philosophy. It refers to the experiential return on an intellectual investment. If an idea has no cash value, it has no discernible consequences when you apply it to empirical reality.
He's almost applying Darwinian ideas here.
Almost exactly. A belief is true, he said, if it worked for all of us and guided us expeditiously through our semi-hospitable world. Intellectual fitness in this model is measured by survival and practical efficacy.
This sounds simple, but it feels like it could resolve so many academic arguments that just get stuck in semantics.
Which is why the squirrel analogy is so powerful. It's the perfect way to show how the pragmatic method actually works.
Okay, so let's walk our listener through it.
All right. The scenario is this. A man is endlessly trying to move around a tree, but a squirrel on the trunk keeps moving to keep the tree between itself or the man. The squirrel is always on the opposite side.
Right.
And so the theoretical question arises, does the man go round the squirrel or not?
And this feels like exactly the kind of pointless argument that philosophy students could spend weeks debating.
Precisely. And James says the argument is idle, meaning useless, until we define the practical consequences of the phrase going around. We have to ask, what observable difference do the opposing answers make?
Because the two people arguing probably mean different things by going round.
They mean completely different things. One might mean circling the physical location of the squirrel. The other might mean occupying the space directly in front of the squirrel's head, then its back, then its tail, and so on.
I see.
So if going round means occupying the space north, east, south, and west of the squirrel's body, then yes, the man has gone round it.
But if going around means seeing its belly, then its back, then its sides.
Then no, the man has not. Once you articulate the physical difference between these two definitions, the argument just evaporates, it's gone.
The genius of it is that it forces you to stop dealing with conceptual ambiguity and start dealing with observable consequences. The rule is, if there is, no difference that doesn't make a difference, then the concept is meaningless.
And James applied this rigorous standard to everything, even the loftiest theological disputes. He argued that the truth of the hypothesis of God, for example, could be tested pragmatically.
How so?
Well, he stated it very clearly. On pragmatic principles, if the hypothesis of God works satisfactorily in the widest sense of the word, it is true.
Okay, but that doesn't mean it's objectively true in some Newtonian sense.
No, not at all. It means it's true in its capacity to generate positive human outcomes. If accepting the belief provides profound moral comfort, if it generates kindness, if it offers the believer a practical pathway through suffering, then that utility justifies its claim to truth within the human context.
So the idea's efficacy determines its truth. It's a powerful defensive belief, but it also sounds almost aggressively subjective.
It does. And that leads us right into the deeper questions of how we acquire knowledge in the first place.
Right, into his epistemology.
James's epistemology went far beyond just pragmatism. He developed a position he called radical empiricism. And this is essential to understand because it's not the dry empiricism of, say, 18th century thinkers like Hume or Locke.
Right. Traditional British empiricism reduced reality purely to discrete sense data. You have the objects, you have the data, but the relations between them.
Were often seen as something the mind imposed on the data. They weren't seen as real parts of the world.
So James flipped that.
He flipped it entirely. Radical empiricism asserts that the world is a mosaic of diverse experiences, but critically, the experiences between objects, the conjunctions, the relationships, the flows, are just as real, concrete, and immediate as the discrete objects themselves.
So the and, the but, the if of experience are part of external reality, not just mental glue we add.
Precisely. He viewed the world as fundamentally continuous, and that continuity is reflected in how we perceive things, which is where we get his most famous psychological concept.
The stream of consciousness.
The stream of consciousness. And this concept really revolutionized the study of the mind. Before James, you had psychologists using structuralism, trying to break consciousness down into these discrete, static, measurable elements.
Like atoms of thought.
Exactly. And James argued this was futile. You cannot halt consciousness for objective analysis. It flows like a river. You can't just stop it.
And what are the key characteristics of this stream?
He identified 4. First, it's personal. It always belongs to oneself. Second, it's constantly changing. You can never step in the same river twice. Third, it's sensibly continuous. The mind perceives itself as whole, flowing from past to present.
And the last one?
It's elective and transactional. It chooses what to focus on and is always in motion towards some practical end. And this concept, had a massive and direct influence on literature. It inspired modernist writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf to structure their novels around it.
So if reality is this flowing, subjective mosaic, how can we possibly justify committing to a belief, especially if the evidence is incomplete? This brings us to his most controversial essay.
The Will to Believe. And here's where it gets really interesting.
It's one of his most debated works.
Oh, for sure. This 1896 doctrine defends the right to choose to believe an unproven hypothesis to violate the standard principle of evidentialism, but only when faced with a choice that is momentous, live, and forced.
Okay, let's break that down. What qualifies as a momentous, live, and forced choice?
All right, so live means the option is intellectually plausible to you. It's a real possibility in your mind. Forced means you cannot avoid making a choice. Even inaction or skepticism is itself a choice with consequences.
And momentous.
Momentous means the results of your choice are unique and significant. James argues that in these situations, particularly in matters of faith or morality, the intellectual risk of believing before all the evidence is in is justified if that belief brings positive, moral, and psychological cash value to your life.
So it's like, if I believe in myself, I might actually succeed, and that success then generates the evidence that my original belief was true.
You've got it.
But if I don't believe in myself, I'll probably fail, and then my lack of belief becomes retrospectively justified. The belief, or lack of it, creates the truth.
Exactly. The act of believing can generate the necessary positive conditions, the fruits, that then verify the belief. The classic example is the man on the mountainside. If he believes he can leap the chasm, he might succeed. If he sits down and waits for proof that he can succeed, he fails by inaction.
But this doctrine drew immediate and heavy fire. Bertrand Russell, for example, was deeply critical. What was the intellectual tension there?
Well, Russell and many others advocated for strict fallibilism. The idea that we must always maintain an objective, detached skepticism, examining all sides, recognizing that none of our current beliefs are perfectly true. For Russell, certainty only comes after the evidence is in.
So the risk, for critics, was that James was just giving a license to wishful thinking, to superstition.
That was the charge. But James's defense was that strict skepticism is simply inappropriate in certain vital areas of human experience, like forming relationships or engaging in moral action. Sometimes, the only way to gain the evidence like trust or success is by making that leap of faith first. He felt the skeptic sacrifices the potential for a deeper, richer life by refusing to act where evidence is scarce.
And this choice, the choice to believe, is the cornerstone of his profound engagement with the concept of free will.
It is. James really set the terms for the modern free will debate by developing what we now call the two-stage model. He separated decision-making into 2 distinct causal steps.
Which are?
Chance, which is indeterministic, and choice, which is deterministic.
Okay, let's break down the role of chance first. What did he mean by that?
Chance is the free element. It represents the pool of possibilities available to us that are not necessitated by everything that came before. When you're standing at a fork in the road Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street, to use his example, both paths are called possibilities.
So it's not chaos.
No, and he was careful to stress that. This indeterminism isn't irrational. It just means the possibilities are not controlled, secured, or necessitated by other things external to the decision maker.
So external reality doesn't dictate the exact outcome, it just provides the menu of possibilities.
A perfect way to put it. The second stage, choice, is where determination comes in. This stage is causally based on the individual's character, their values, their accumulated memories, their feelings. This is the stage where we determine the outcome from that available menu.
So our freedom is found in the effort we exert to sustain one choice over another.
Yes. And he also very clearly defined the philosophical opposition. Hard determinism, which is just fatalism, soft determinism, and his own indeterminism. He reserved his most colorful language for soft determinism, or compatibilism.
He was merciless toward it.
Absolutely. He called it a quagmire of evasion.
Why did he find that reconciliation so philosophically intolerable? What was the evasion?
For James, the crucial practical consequence of free will is the concept of regret and moral judgment. If the universe is fully determined, then all evil, all suffering, all regret must happen. It's all baked in.
Which means you can't really condemn them.
You can't. If they must happen, we cannot morally condemn them. The universe is a single, beautiful, terrible, inevitable whole, and any feeling of I should have done otherwise becomes an illusion.
So soft determinism is essentially telling us we feel free, but that feeling is meaningless because the choice was inevitable, and that completely removes the practical function of moral accountability.
Exactly. It tries to reconcile necessity with freedom by stripping freedom of its moral weight. James argued that the free will option is pragmatically truer because it better accommodates the reality of moral regret and the practical necessity of holding ourselves and others accountable for choosing between possibilities.
And his own commitment to this principle was intensely personal.
Absolutely. The philosophical breakthrough that helped him emerge from his soul sickness was recorded in his diary in 1870. Drawing on Renouvelier's work, James made this ultimate commitment, declaring, "My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will."
He chose it because it was the belief that delivered the greatest moral and practical satisfaction.
Proving its own truth in his own life.
That concept of choice and action leading to a psychological reality leads us perfectly into his revolutionary contribution to psychology, the James Lange theory of emotion. This theory takes that philosophical idea of action first and applies it directly to human feeling, flipping common sense on its head.
This is one of the most famous theoretical reversals in all of psychological history. The traditional common sense view says, event leads to emotion, which leads to a physical reaction.
For example, I see a dangerous snake, I feel terror, then I run and scream.
Right. James, formulating this simultaneously with the Danish physiologist Carl Lange, said that sequence is completely backward.
Let's use the classic bear example to illustrate the James Lange theory.
Okay, the bear example. We do not see a bear, fear it, and then run. James argued the process is, we see the bear, the stimulus, and consequently our body initiates a physiological defense mechanism. We run, our heart races, we tremble, and it is the mind's perception of those physical changes that constitutes the emotion of fear.
So wait, we feel afraid because we are trembling and running, not the other way around.
That's the theory. It still causes cognitive dissonance for a lot of people.
Yeah, it does. So if I want to feel confident, should I just start walking like I'm confident and the feeling will follow?
In a sense, yes. James stressed that the mental aspect of emotion, the feeling, is largely a perception of its physiology. This idea has enormous implications for clinical psychology even today. If you want to change an emotion, you must change the physical signature.
So different emotions feel different because they have different physiological signatures.
Precisely. Fear involves the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. Love or contentment often involves the parasympathetic system, rest and digest. Our unique emotional life is simply the subjective experience of unique patterns of internal physical feedback.
And this physical first view also had consequences for how James viewed aesthetics, art, and beauty.
It did. He distinguished between how we appreciate things, breaking aesthetic pleasure into two types, primary and secondary.
Okay, so what's primary sensation?
Primary sensation is the pure, immediate, and direct pleasure we take in sensory inputs. A perfect musical chord, the ideal symmetry of a line, a vibrant color arrangement. He linked this to classical taste, immediate, unadulterated sensation.
And secondary pleasures are what comes after.
They're the added, or repercussion backwards, pleasures. They aren't inherent in the sensation itself, but are tied to what the sensation reminds us of, or the subsequent emotional and physical reactions it generates. For instance, finding a certain color beautiful because it reminds you of your childhood home.
That makes sense.
James noted that the endless battles between classicism and romanticism often boil down to which of these two types of pleasure, the pure sensation or the subsequent emotional fallout one, prioritizes.
Moving beyond singular feelings, James gave us an immensely complex and useful framework for personal identity, dividing the self into the observer and the observed, the I and the me.
This division is foundational to modern self-psychology. The I, or the pure ego, is the thinking, acting self, the subject. It's indivisible and linked, James suggested, to the mind or the soul.
And its function is to provide continuity.
Exactly, the thread of continuity, that persistent feeling that you, the perceiver, are the same person you were yesterday. It arises from that continuous, flowing stream of consciousness. The I is the knower.
And the me, or the empirical me, is the self as an object of personal experience, what we know about ourselves.
Precisely. The me is the known, and James broke it down into three concentric spheres, moving from the most external to the most intimate.
The material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. The material self sounds simple, but James gave it much more weight than just our physical body.
He did. The material self includes everything a person owns or belongs to. The body is the core, but extending outward are our clothes, which James specifically noted are crucial because they express identity and status, our money, our house, and even our immediate family.
So he argued that losing a family member is devastating because it's experienced as losing a part of one's own material self.
Yes, our possessions, our relations, they're extensions of who we are.
Okay, next, the social self, which explains why we behave differently in different contexts.
The social self is relational. It's who we are in a given social situation, and James famously argued that people have as many social selves as social groups they participate in.
So you act differently with your boss than you do with your best friend.
Of course. Consider how you speak to a colleague during a formal meeting versus how you interact with your closest friends at a bar. Both are genuine versions of you, but they are distinct social selves operating simultaneously. This concept is immensely valuable today for understanding things like identity presentation on social media.
And finally, the deepest layer, the spiritual self.
The spiritual self is the most intimate and durable part of the me. This is the subjective core. Our personality, our core values, our conscience, our capacity for reason. It's the seat of introspection where we look inward to grapple with moral and intellectual questions.
And he believed achieving self-understanding here was the most rewarding.
Far more rewarding and permanent than satisfying the demands of the material or social selves.
This synthesis is what makes James truly unique. He was wrestling with two great opposing schools of thought in the 19th century, spiritualism and associationism.
Right, and he pragmatically combined them. He took the usable parts of both.
So associationism was the hard mechanistic theory.
Very mechanistic. Favored by early psychologists, suggesting complex ideas form from simple physical changes in the brain associations happening on a purely atomic or physiological level. James criticized this as psychology without a soul. It lacked the capacity to explain choice.
And spiritualism was the opposite extreme, arguing that everything was tied together by an indivisible soul, enabling moral and unified behavior.
And James recognized that both were incomplete. The brain needed a mechanism, which associationism explained, but the person needed an agent, which spiritualism explained.
So he integrated them.
He solved it by integrating the I, the soul, or the will, with the mechanism of the brain. The brain offers a set of associated options, but it is the I, the conscious self, that decides which part of that association to focus on, thus determining the direction of future behavior. The conscious will acts as the decisive filter on the mechanism. That synthesis is the functional framework that made his work so foundational.
James's desire to accommodate experience that mechanistic science couldn't fully explain led him to write one of his masterpieces, The Varieties of Religious Experience, in 1902. He approached religion not as a theologian, but as a psychologist and pragmatist.
That is the crucial distinction. He was interested in the experience of religion, not the dogmas or institutions. He emphasized what he called religious genius.
The raw, intense, personal encounter with the divine.
Exactly. Over the formal structures that later develop around that genius. Institutions, he argued, are merely the second-hand social descendant of that original primary experience.
He also believed that psychologists should actively seek out the extreme, the intense, even the pathological varieties of human experience. Why? That seems counterintuitive to the study of the average mind.
Because, he argued, they act as a microscope of the mind. By studying the intense emotional or intellectual peaks, pathologies, conversion experiences, mystical states, they reveal the normal processes of the mind in a drastically enlarged, exaggerated, and easier-to-observe form.
So they let us see the fundamental machinery of belief and perception that's too subtle in everyday life.
You've got it. And to interpret those amplified experiences, he argued we need overbeliefs.
An overbelief being what?
The necessary assumption we make to live a fuller, better life, even if it cannot be absolutely proven by our empirical experience. For instance, the overbelief that the universe is fundamentally moral, or that your efforts will ultimately pay off. They're essential, pragmatic assumptions that give life structure and purpose.
This pursuit of the extreme led James himself to experiment with various substances, chloral hydrate, peyote, and the famous nitrous oxide experiments.
Yes, to access what he called the great subliminal or transmarginal region of consciousness.
And his notes on nitrous oxide are legendary.
They are. James was a lifelong anti-Hegelian, fighting against the philosophy of absolute unity. Yet under the influence of the gas, he claimed he achieved a tremendously exciting sense of an intense metaphysical illumination.
Where all the opposites vanished.
He wrote of experiencing the dissolution of all binary oppositions, subject-object, good-evil, past-present, where every opposition vanished in a higher unity.
It sounds like a profoundly jarring yet temporary spiritual experience that directly contradicted his lifelong philosophy.
It was, and that is exactly why he focused on it. He used these chemically induced states and spontaneous mystical experiences to try and categorize the phenomena scientifically, which led to his articulation of the 4 criteria of mysticism.
Okay, let's walk through those criteria, which are still used in religious and psychological studies today.
First is ineffability. The mystical experience cannot be adequately described in normal words or language. It necessitates direct, first-hand experience for true understanding.
The mystic can't really explain it to the non-mystic.
Not fully. Second is the noetic quality. This is critical. The experience is not just a feeling. It is experienced as a state of knowledge. The mystic feels they have gained authoritative insight into fundamental truths that are inaccessible to ordinary rational reasoning. It feels like being taught something profound about reality.
Third, transiency.
These states cannot be sustained for long periods. They are fleeting, lasting only minutes or hours, though they leave a profound, lasting impression.
And finally, passivity.
During the experience, the individual feels as if their personal will is suspended. They feel grasped by a superior power or external force. They're undergoing an experience, not creating it.
So on a pragmatic level, what weight did James grant these unique individual experiences?
He established a clear, pragmatic boundary. The epistemological authority of a mystical experience is justified for the individual who has it. It changes their life, and for them, it's a truth with massive cash value. But James stressed that others, the rest of the world, are under no obligation to accept that truth uncritically.
That is such a classic Jamesian middle ground. It's true for the individual, but not universally imposed.
Exactly. However, he did argue that the mere existence of these phenomena suggests an intrinsic incompleteness in non-mystical, purely rational epistemology. He was asserting that there might be a subliminal world or an unseen world that produces real, tangible effects within human consciousness, and therefore must be treated as a kind of reality.
This desire to reconcile real-world problems with theological concepts also led him to advocate for a specific view of God regarding the problem of evil.
Yes, he was an advocate of theistic finitism. This concept seeks to pragmatically solve the problem of evil. How can an all-good, all-powerful God allow suffering?
Right.
By arguing that God is not omnipotent, omniscient, or pervasive, but is rather finite.
How does finitude solve the problem?
A finite God struggles. This God is good, but is wrestling against the forces of evil and chaos in the universe, rather than being responsible for them. This means that evil is a real existential battle, not just a necessary part of an omnipotent plan.
And pragmatically, that encourages human cooperation with God against evil.
Precisely. Our efforts matter in the cosmic struggle. It makes God a partner, not a remote master.
And his curiosity about the limits of reality also led him to the scientific edges of the time. Psychical research.
James was intensely involved. He was a founder and vice president of the American Society for Psychical Research. He was convinced that the strict materialist framework of science was incomplete, and he saw psychical phenomena like telepathy as his way of proving it.
He used the concept of the white crow to explain his methodology, right?
Yes, it's a fantastic metaphor. The rule is that if you wish to upset the law that all crows are black, it is enough to prove that one crow is white. James believed the medium Leonora Piper was his white crow.
He was incredibly impressed by her.
He was. She seemed to possess knowledge she couldn't have gained through normal means.
But even James, the believer in the unseen, maintained his scientific skepticism about the explanation.
Absolutely. He was a pragmatist first. While he accepted the phenomenon was real, he personally found the popular spirit control hypothesis incoherent. He suggested rational sources for Piper's knowledge could include telepathy, tapping into the collective unconscious, or, most mundanely,
Right.
information gleaned through gossip of servants. He noted that a maid in his own household was friendly with a maid in Piper's house, and mundane information gathering needed to be ruled out before leaping to spirits. He demanded rigorous testing, even for the phenomena he personally wanted to be true.
James's pragmatism extended into his views on history and society, wading into the classic debate about whether historical change is driven by exceptional individuals or by broad sociological laws.
This was the classic great man theory, championed by Thomas Carlyle versus sociological determinism. James tackled this in his 1880 essay, Great Men, Great Thoughts, and the Environment. And typically, he found a synthesis.
So who did he side with? The great man or the great forces?
He sided firmly with the view that individuals are the motive power of history. He borrowed a concept directly from Darwin, arguing that a philosopher must accept genius as a spontaneous given entity like Darwin's spontaneous variations in biology.
So societal mutations, he argued, are initiated by these individuals.
The ones whose genius or accidental position of authority makes them ferments, or initiators of movements.
But the genius can't succeed in a vacuum. The environment has to be ready.
Exactly. The success of the ferment is contingent on the receptivities of the moment. The social environment, the epoch, the culture must be ready to receive that particular idea. So for James, history is the result of chance, the appearance of genius, and choice, the social environment choosing to adopt and amplify that genius.
It's interesting that a man who borrowed so much from Darwin vehemently rejected the most popular social extension of Darwinian thought at the time.
You mean social Darwinism? His rejection was categorical. While he accepted biological evolution and applied its principles to intellectual fitness, James regarded social Darwinism, popularized by Herbert Spencer, as a sham.
So he rejected the cutthroat survival of the fittest application to human society.
Completely. He was deeply skeptical of its use, especially when deployed to justify notions of Anglo-Saxon superiority or the oppression of the working class.
And this wasn't a popular stance among the Harvard elite in the 1870s and 80s.
It was a minority opinion, and it speaks to James's unwavering moral commitment. He saw social Darwinism as a morally bankrupt justification for inequality, lacking the practical moral cash value he demanded from any true philosophy.
Finally, we have to look at his lasting legacy on civic life and virtue, which is captured in his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War.
Derived from a 1906 speech, this essay grappled with a core political problem. How do you maintain essential martial virtues, discipline, loyalty, tenacity, sacrifice, in a society that is not actively engaged in war?
He recognized that war, while horrific, channels collective energy and instills civic commitment.
He didn't want the death and destruction, but he recognized the moral force that war provided. So he looked for a pragmatic solution, his moral equivalent.
And what was it?
He proposed a national civilian service, specifically a term of public labor for all young men and women. This service would involve difficult, uncomfortable labor working in coal mines, fishing fleets, or road construction.
So a kind of rite of passage.
Exactly. Designed to instill discipline, responsibility, and civic virtue, or as he put it, to get the childishness knocked out of them. He wanted to channel that aggressive youthful energy and the need for collective sacrifice into productive, constructive goals.
And that essay was enormously influential.
It was. It lent its name and theme decades later to President Jimmy Carter's 1977 speech on the energy crisis, where Carter equated the national challenge and sacrifice needed for energy independence with a moral equivalent of war. James was seeking a productive, peaceful, yet rigorous way for society to channel its energies toward the common good.
William James left us a monumental intellectual gift. He was a thinker who just refused the easy boundaries, moving seamlessly between neurological science, rigorous philosophy, and the deepest questions of religious faith.
Hmm.
He really gave us the tools for navigating uncertainty, a definition of truth that demands practical, verifiable results, a radical new way to understand our feelings as physiological perceptions, and a complex, practical framework for the multiple selves we embody.
His triumph really was the synthesis. He took the mechanistic, physical ideas of associationism and integrated them with the spiritual view of an indivisible will. He created a functional, usable psychology that recognized both the physical mechanism and the agent of choice.
He showed that mind and body, spirit and science weren't necessarily warring concepts.
Not at all. They could be integrated into a single framework that helps us live a better, fuller life. His insistence that an idea must work is the ultimate American contribution to philosophy.
And his most profound pragmatic choice was that personal declaration. Choosing to believe in free will because it was the belief that would yield the highest moral and personal satisfaction.
It was the belief that made his world work better. So if the truth of any concept hinges on its practical consequences, if its worth is determined by its cash value in your life, then the necessary final question for this deep dive is this. Considering the choices and challenges immediately ahead of you, what foundational belief, if you chose to embrace it entirely and act upon it today, would yield the greatest cash value in your own life? What belief would make your world fundamentally and practically truer?
A truly practical thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the transformative thought and radical utility of William James. We hope you feel thoroughly informed and armed with new intellectual tools.